I recently spent an evening at a high-end gallery opening, and, the conversation inevitably drifted toward the new loss and damage climate funds. I found myself talking to this woman, a high-level ESG consultant, and she spoke about these global wealth transfers with a fervor that was almost unsettling. Her eyes widened as she described the moral necessity of the West paying its climate debt. She was using words like atonement and original sin, speaking not like a policy expert, but, well, more like a medieval monk, describing the sale of indulgences to cleanse a stained soul. To her, carbon wasn't just an element. It was this metaphysical mark of guilt that could only be washed away by a massive administrative redistribution of wealth. But the whole atmosphere shifted the moment I asked a practical question. I brought up a report I'd read about a small manufacturing town in the Midwest. The local foundry, the town's only real employer, was shuttering because of the very energy taxes that were funding her atonement. And her expression, it didn't soften with sympathy. It hardened into this mask of clinical indifference. She didn't see people losing their livelihoods. She saw necessary friction in the managed decline of an obsolete era. She even used a phrase that it really stuck with me. The industrial flame has to flicker out for the planet to breathe. That instantaneous pivot from this performative, almost saintly empathy for the global South to a cold, almost eager contempt for the working class in her own backyard, it was jarring. It revealed a deeper, more cynical reality behind the whole climate justice narrative. It wasn't about the environment at all. It was about the thrill of what you could call an epistemological coup. It's the logic of a new managerial elite who view human development as a pathology and their own bureaucratic control as the only cure. This bizarre mix of neo-pagan religious zeal and ruthless financial engineering. It made me realize we aren't just discussing atmospheric science anymore. We're witnessing a kind of civilizational death instinct dressed up as planetary salvation, a global scale trap where the debt is infinite and the only ones finding redemption are the ones holding the ledger. That story, as shocking as it is, I think it provides the perfect illustration of the ideological conflict at play today. It just shows how easily this high moral rhetoric can conceal a really clinical financial ruthlessness. So our mission for this deep dive is to look directly at the underlying systems that enable this contradiction. We need to understand precisely how these massive global wealth transfers, often disguised as climate justice, are, while how they're accelerating the erosion of the Western working and middle class, systematically compromising national sovereignty, and ultimately ushering in an entirely new era of technocratic control.
And that narrative provides the necessary frame, doesn't it? It highlights that moral sleight of hand that's required to implement these vast, really non-democratic policies. We're going to structure this deep dive around three interconnected systemic pressures that seem to be driving this new reality.
Okay.
First, there's the intense economic squeeze on the people who actually produce goods and services. We can call it the extraction layer. Second, the increasing geopolitical strain, which is driven by physical limits on energy and critical resources. And third, the sociological reality of how the managerial class uses these crises to replace democratic control with top-down technocratic mandates.
A slide toward neo-feudalism.
Exactly, a discernible slide toward what can only be described as neo-feudalism.
Let's start right there with that economic squeeze, because the mechanism behind that financial extraction, it has a name, a deliberately provocative name, Lenocracy.
The term Lenocracy is intentionally jarring. It comes from the Latin word leno,
which means
it translates directly to pimp. And the analysis uses this term precisely because it wants to contrast this form of extraction with simple corruption or even typical taxation.
So it's a very specific kind of system.
It is. Lenocracy defines a political economy where the individuals who engage in actual productive economic activity, the ones who farm, build, manufacture, provide tangible services, are systematically squeezed dry. They become the victims of various kinds of legally mandated parasitism.
And this is carried out by the class that controls the bureaucracy and finance.
That's the one. The class that controls the bureaucracy, the financial infrastructure, and the whole regulatory environment.
Okay, so how is this different from old-fashioned rent-seeking or just simple cronyism? Our audience is sophisticated. Why insist on a word like lenocracy instead of just calling it bureaucratic capture?
That's a crucial distinction. Rent-seeking is often localized, it's transactional. Lenocracy, as it's defined here, is systemic, it's structural, and it relies on the enforcement of complex, often contradictory regulations.
Regulations that aren't actually for efficiency or safety.
Not primarily, no. They're designed to create friction that only the regulatory class can profit from solving. The essential core of it is that most people who appear to be making significant money in our post-industrial economies, especially in the US and its allies, are doing so not by producing tangible value themselves,
but by taking a cut.
by exploiting or taking a mandatory cut, a systemic fee from those who do produce. And the whole system depends heavily on the voluntary, or at least the compliant, submission of its victims.
Laborers, the small business owners.
The consumers who absorb all these endless layers of cost, it requires their participation.
So if we connect this idea of systemic extraction to the macro level performance of these nations, what do we see? Because if the system is really optimized for parasitic extraction and not productive output, we should be seeing some measurable operational failures.
We do, and they are stunningly revealing. The analysis points out that countries operating under this Lenocratic system are increasingly unable to perform simple, straightforward infrastructure tasks.
Like what?
Well, efficiently or cost-effectively. I mean, think about recent news events. You see these wealthy, technologically advanced nations that struggle to repair a wrecked highway bridge within a reasonable time frame, or to provide something as basic as standardized artillery shells for an ally, without these massive multi-year delays and exponentially ballooning costs.
Right.
These failures are direct proof that the real economy, the one dealing in non-financial goods and services, is shrinking. It's becoming rigid, even as this horde of Lenocrats frantically tries to maintain their habitual take and increase the complexity of the regulations.
The system is eating itself.
It's consuming itself, yeah.
And that shrinking productivity is directly linked to the power structure, the sheer scale of that bureaucratic overhead. It immediately makes me think of that epistemological coup I mentioned in the opening. Let's try to define that for everyone, because it's a critical concept. If the legislative bodies are just a sideshow, where is the real power located?
The epistemological coup is defined as the replacement of empirical truth, traditional morality, and functional expertise with a new, self-serving bureaucratic logic.
It's a coup.
It's a coup because the managerial class successfully captures the authority to decide what counts as knowledge and what counts as moral necessity, like that climate atonement narrative you encountered. The machinery of representative government, whether it's Congress or Parliament, has been essentially shunted aside.
It's become a sideshow.
A sideshow, almost a theater, where politicians go through their routines for public consumption.
So real policy is determined somewhere else entirely.
Absolutely. Most real effective policy in the modern West is no longer decided in the legislative chambers, where the public can, theoretically hold power accountable. It's determined within the vast, overlapping and largely opaque realms of government, corporate, and nonprofit bureaucracies.
And the politicians just rubber stamp it.
The legislative branch often just rubber stamps the formalities as an afterthought. They're legitimizing decisions that have already been made by these unelected bodies. And we see this policy capture is pervasive and is deeply connected to contemporary economic practice, especially in sectors that used to rely on rapid innovation.
If we look at the tech sector, for instance, which was supposed to be the engine of growth, you can see this dynamic so clearly. The focus shifts from innovation to just consolidation.
That's the classic sign of diminishing returns in a core industry. When the potential for truly groundbreaking, revolutionary new technology plateaus, the sector shifts its priority to corporate consolidation and market monopolization.
Right.
Once these companies control a massive market share, often facilitated by favorable regulatory treatment, which is a key mechanism of Lenocracy, they boost profits through pure structural extraction.
How so?
A common critical mechanism mentioned is the widespread shift to gig contract labor. This lets managers deny full-time minimum wage, benefits, retirement contributions.
Significantly cutting their employment costs.
Exactly. It is profit derived not from engineering a new future, but from exploiting human capital within a system that enables that exploitation through regulatory loopholes and the constant threat of unemployment.
This sounds like a system that's constantly generating regulatory complexity, financial complexity, to hide the fact that the underlying productivity is actually declining. That idea of diminishing returns becomes critical, and it's captured perfectly by Tainter's curve regarding the cost of complexity.
Tainter's work on the collapse of complex societies showed that complexity is an energy sink. When you apply this to bureaucracy, you see the mechanism of extraction perfectly. There's a great illustration of this using the evolution of building codes, specifically fire safety regulations.
Okay.
Regulations concerning mandatory setbacks, specific fire-rated siding, fire escapes, egress windows, many of which came from genuine tragedies like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, initially offered massive life-saving returns on investment.
Sure, highly effective, low-cost gains.
Exactly. But the bureaucratic machine can never rest, can it? It has to continue to expand its territory.
Right, it has to justify its own existence.
Precisely. As time goes on, the bureaucracy, because its existence depends on generating new rules, begins mandating increasingly minute and esoteric requirements. For instance, consider the move to require fire sprinklers in all new residential construction, or hyper-specific rules on the material composition of every single light fixture.
We're far down Tainter's curve at that point.
We are operating far, far down Tainter's curve now. High costs are incurred, the cost of materials, the cost of inspections, specialized labor, for increasingly marginal, fractional reductions in statistical risk. While every life saved is valued, the systemic cost is crippling.
And the bureaucratic machine prioritizes expanding complexity.
Even when the benefit is vanishingly small compared to the crushing overhead it creates for builders, for small businesses, and ultimately for the consumer. This overhead is the hidden tax that maintains the Lenocracy.
And that overhead leads us directly to the sociological shift. If this hyper-complex extractive market system is failing, what's the default political economy that emerges? That's where the idea of neo-feudalism comes in.
Neo-feudalism, as it's defined here, emerges as the normal political economy of a post-market society. We're accustomed to thinking of the market as the natural state, but the complex market economy, one reliant on cheap, abundant, globally sourced energy and intricate, reliable supply chains, that's actually an historical anomaly.
Right.
When that foundation breaks down, when energy scarcity and high extraction costs make globalized complexity impossible, people must inevitably shift toward local autonomous operation, autarky.
And in that contraction, the nature of power changes. It moves from abstract capital control to direct, localized managerial control.
Exactly. The managerial class, the ESG consultants, the bureaucrats, the global NGO networks, they don't disappear. They simply change their mode of control. They use mandates like the carbon asceticism derived from the rhetoric you heard to replace democratic governance with their preferred mode of technocratic control.
So managed decline and necessary friction is their justification.
It's their justification for implementing these control structures. They're establishing a new form of vassalage, one enforced through endless indebtedness, mandatory compliance with arbitrary rules, and the monopolization of resources.
We can see the pure, staggering cost required to maintain this Lenocracy when we look at the economics of the small producer, the very person the system claims to champion. I mean, the self-employed vendor at a local farmer's market trying to sell a genuine, tangible product is just crushed by this extraction layer.
The numbers are stark, and they illustrate the fundamental asymmetry of the system. For a self-employed individual producer just trying to make an honest living by selling goods, every single purchase is immediately hit by multiple forms of extraction that go directly to supporting the financial and regulatory infrastructure.
Okay, let's break that down.
Let's break down the layers of extraction before federal income tax even enters the picture. First, there's sales tax, which in some cited urban examples sits at 5.3%. Then, if they accept electronic payment, you have credit card processing fees, often 2.6%, plus a flat charge per transaction.
And market fees.
Right. If they're selling at a market, there are stall fees, which can be another 4.5% of sales, plus a flat yearly fee just to secure a spot. And then because they're self-employed, they are responsible for the full payroll tax burden, both employer and employee portions.
Which is currently what?
It currently sits at a staggering 15.3%.
Wait, 15.3% payroll tax on top of all those other fees?
Yes. So if you add up the sales tax, credit card fees, market fees, and payroll taxes, you realize that a substantial percentage of the gross revenue from a small producer is immediately channeled right back into the system.
It's an immense, unavoidable overhead.
It is, just to allow a productive person to operate within the framework of the Lenocracy. And if you compare this high extraction rate for a physical producer to the often negligible effective tax rates of large corporations who use complex financial instruments to defer or avoid those burdens entirely, well, you see the definition of elite parasitism in action.
So if that is the staggering non-negotiable cost levied against the people who actually produce, we have to ask, where is that extracted capital actually going? That brings us perfectly to our next section, where we look at the financial mechanisms of this wealth transfer and the specific context of the green transition.
The problem isn't just the capitals being extracted, it's the extreme misallocation and, frankly, the outright corruption on the spending side, particularly when it comes to the financialization of the energy transition.
There's one example of this that's it's shocking.
There is a vivid example of capital misallocation in projects funded by public debt that should make everyone pause.
Give us the number, because I remember reading this and not being able to believe it.
The example is this. $7 billion was spent using public funds earmarked for the transition to install only 7 functional electric vehicle chargers.
7. So that's $1 billion per charger.
$1 billion spent per charger. That kind of figure is beyond mere inefficiency. This isn't just waste. It is a sign that massive corruption and systemic financial leakage are built directly into the system of managed decline and green transition spending.
That number is almost impossible to process. How does anyone justify that as necessary friction rather than just simple criminal negligence or a deliberate wealth transfer?
The argument is that this waste isn't an accident to be optimized away. In many ways, it's central to the process. Green energy schemes are increasingly viewed by the managerial elite as just another mechanism of financialization.
They're just tools.
They are tools to justify generating massive public debt and directing enormous capital flows to specific, politically favored actors who manage the projects, regardless of the physical outcome. This process acts like the Cantillon effect within the green economy.
Meaning those closest to the money printer benefit first.
The consultants, the banks, the contractors, they benefit first, while the purchasing power of the distant working and middle classes is systematically eroded as that debt burden is socialized.
So the goal is just to keep the extraction and financialization machine running, even if the projects themselves are laughably inefficient. And this ties directly into the global debt frenzy.
Precisely. Global debt currently sits around $88 trillion. To service that monumental level of debt requires relentless, accelerated extraction and resource depletion. The drive for green schemes, whether it's billion-dollar EV chargers or massive, inefficient solar farms, is used as the justification for generating this debt.
It's a self-perpetuating cycle.
This cycle contributes directly to financial instability and the continued squeezing of physical resources, even resources like oil production, that are necessary simply to service the interest payments on that enormous global debt load. It's a system optimizing for centralized financial extraction in the face of resource collapse.
We've been talking about financial abstractions, but let's hit the energy reality check, because the rhetoric says we're transitioning seamlessly, yet the data on the ground shows critical physical limits are being reached. This brings us to the counterintuitive economic dynamic of the affordability ceiling.
The affordability ceiling is a crucial concept to grasp. Economic theory often suggests that resource scarcity should lead to consistently high prices, which would then spur new investment in production.
Right, high prices should signal a need for more supply.
But the data shows the opposite happening in many key commodity markets. It is consistently low. Price is low because the global consumer simply cannot afford higher costs that actually prevent the necessary large-scale investment in new extraction and production.
So the market can't price things high enough to incentivize new production.
Exactly. The market is unable to price the commodities at a high enough level to justify the massive, risky capital investment required to find and produce the next generation of resources. This results in the falling production of key commodities because the consumer's wallet sets the maximum price, not the cost of extraction. This ceiling becomes particularly terrifying when we look at the critical minerals required for the green transition like copper and platinum. What does the world energy data show regarding these essential inputs?
The data on copper and platinum is highly concerning. The expectations for the energy transition are based on massive, sustained growth in their availability. But production of both is relatively flat or even declining in some key regions.
And demand is supposed to be skyrocketing.
It is. So this lack of growth strongly suggests that the physical, geological, and economic limits are being reached. For example, copper ore grades are declining globally, meaning producers have to move exponentially more rock and water to yield the same amount of metal, driving costs up against that affordability ceiling.
And the constraints on one mineral can create a ripple effect on other technologies.
Absolutely. Take platinum. It's crucial for existing applications like catalytic converters, but it's also essential for the hydrogen economy. specifically for hydrogen fuel cells.
Right.
The market expectation for hydrogen requires vast increases in platinum output, yet the data indicates stagnation. This just underscores the reality that these material constraints are setting the pace, not technological desire or technocratic mandates.
And these constraints are often tied directly to the existing energy matrix and crumbling infrastructure, which creates a kind of feedback loop of decline.
Look at South Africa. It's the largest global platinum producer. Their ability to mine this next-age metal is severely constrained by fundamental internal problems linked to its own dwindling coal supply. South Africa hit peak coal back in 2014 and persistent rail transportation issues.
So if the trains can't run,
If the trains can't run reliably because there isn't enough reliable domestic energy, the platinum can't get from the mine to the port. The ability to mine a new-age metal is shackled by the dwindling supply of an old-age fuel and decaying infrastructure. It just confirms that physical limits trump policy every single time.
if the mineral constraints are alarming, the liquid fuel constraints are arguably more immediately dangerous, given their importance to global logistics. Let's talk about the impending diesel cliff.
This data point is critical because it impacts every single physical supply chain. World diesel supplies, the workhorse fuel for global shipping, heavy equipment, agriculture, military emergency generators, they are not rising sufficiently to keep pace with population growth and industrial demand.
And there's an analysis that puts a date on this.
There was one extremely serious analysis that projects that diesel imports will become practically unavailable to most countries, with the exception of the massive strategically prioritized economies of China and India around the year 2027.
2027. That is not a long-term problem. That is 3 years from now. What does that mean in practical terms? Why are China and India the exceptions?
This diesel shortage will break everything that matters because it immediately fractures our complex global supply chains. Diesel runs the ships that bring goods across the ocean, the trains that move containers inland, the tractors that plant and harvest our food.
And the trucks that take food from the farm to the store.
Exactly. A shortage means immediate inflation, food security risks, and industrial shutdown. China and India are exceptions, primarily because of their immense domestic refining capacity and their ability to prioritize domestic needs through state control, potentially at the expense of exports, when global supply inevitably tightens.
For the rest of the world relying on imports.
The cost will become prohibitive, triggering a massive, rapid contraction in global trade logistics.
This pressure, the anticipation of this physical constraint, it must be driving some of the strange governmental behaviors and policy decisions we're seeing, especially regarding Western industrial capacity.
That leads directly to our next point, the asymmetric deindustrialization of the West. If the core problem is a combination of financial extraction, which is Lenocracy, and resource depletion, like the diesel cliff, the effect is a clear, managed collapse of industrial capacity in the developed world.
The data from Europe is cited as the most dramatic evidence of this managed decline.
It is utterly stark. Passenger car output in Italy, a founding industrial nation of the European project, fell by an alarming 46% recently. That's its lowest level since 1956. This is not a cyclical downturn. This is structural collapse.
Yeah, perfect storm.
It is. Western European automotive manufacturing is crumbling due to deep dependence on imported resources like reliable energy, persistent regulatory uncertainty driven by increasingly aggressive green mandates, and fierce competition from Chinese brands that just are not facing the same internal constraints or resource price ceilings.
The policies are self-sabotaging.
When ideology overrides sound economics, you get catastrophic market reactions. The analysis even noted the massive 98% crash in Jaguar sales in Europe following a controversial rebrand aimed at embracing the electric future. The consumer response was just rejection. It shows the extreme fragility of these old, capital-intensive brands when faced simultaneously with external resource pressure and internal ideological rigidity.
They're accelerating their own managed decline.
They are.
And this deindustrialization is being actively exacerbated by policy choices that look more and more like economic warfare. This brings us back to tariffs and resource scarcity.
Tariffs and embargoes are morphing into weapons of resource scarcity and logistical defense. The push toward tariffs on key resources, like copper, or even the push for localizing production, it may be an intentional or even an unconscious measure designed to reduce the need for long-distance shipping.
Because of the diesel shortage.
If the global system expects a diesel shortage around 2027, then policies that reduce reliance on massive container ships running on high-cost diesel become militarily and economically sensible, even if they contradict decades of globalist policy.
And that brings up a troubling historical parallel, that resource control is central to conflict and systemic change.
The historical record is crystal clear on this. Resource control is the deep current of conflict. Leading up to World War II, the United States imposed increasing restrictions on oil exports to Japan and imposed a massive trade embargo on Germany. Why? Because the aggressive expansion of those nations was correctly viewed as a direct threat to American resource security and control over critical strategic materials.
So embargoes and tariffs are a form of warfare.
Fundamentally, they are ways of fighting a war or preparing for conflict without firing a shot. The fact that modern policies are moving so rapidly toward protectionism, localization, and resource hoarding, it signals that we are not in a period of ideological debate. We are in a period of escalating resource conflict driven by hard physical limits.
Okay, so let's synthesize where we are. The system we inhabit is a lenocracy, a complex, extractive machine that is financially corrupt, physically constrained by imminent energy limits, and actively replacing democracy with technocratic managerial control. If that is the reality, the conventional approach trying to vote the right people in or lobbying the system seems utterly futile. What is the individual response? What can you actually do?
The answer is not to try and fix the system on its terms. It's about understanding the fundamental nature of power and then recognizing that you succeed by avoiding the system's gravitational pull entirely. You have to move the struggle someplace else.
Let's elaborate on that concept of power, because the argument is that power is never an abstraction. It is always dependent on context.
Power requires context for its deployment. A powerful, rigid, but clumsy system, which is the definition of Lenocracy, can be defeated if you simply refuse to fight on its chosen ground. There's a historical comparison to the United States' overwhelming military and economic power trying to compel submission in places like Afghanistan.
Right.
Despite immense technological superiority, the clumsy invader was ultimately ineffective against a force that knew how to avoid situations where that power could be deployed effectively. The lesson is, do not engage the bureaucracy on its battlefield.
So move to arenas where you set the rules.
Exactly, where the bureaucracy cannot follow. The vast, overlapping bureaucratic machine, despite its immense complexity, has an inherent weakness: its inability to manage every micro aspect of human life, especially as societies become more crowded and, well, ramshackle.
The administrative burden just becomes too great.
Exactly. Much of what happens in dense, complex societies goes unmanaged and even unnoticed by the bureaucrats. The argument is that much of what we accept as governance is actually a delusion in the minds of the governed. The Lenocracy depends overwhelmingly on the voluntary submission of its victims, the citizens, consumers, producers.
So you have to cure yourself of that delusion.
When you do, and you recognize the vast swaths of life that are outside the bureaucratic gaze, which the managerial class is too busy issuing grand mandates to even notice, the world opens up as a much more viable and interesting place. That recognition is where the opt-out begins.
Let's get extremely practical then. How do we start defining and implementing strategies for self-determination? Where does the opt-out start for a working person or a family?
It starts with the realm where you have the most immediate control, your own financial resilience and independence from the employment racket. A primary crucial strategy for families is working toward the ability to maintain oneself on one income.
Why is that so important?
Because it allows the other partner to exit the formal employment racket, system of commuting, excessive tax withholding, corporate control, and instead develop skills and an income stream outside the traditional 9-to-5 market structure.
There are some personal examples of this working.
There are. One commentator noted how they were able to pivot their writing from a mere hobby into a profession while being a house husband, and they eventually became the full-time breadwinner when their spouse's health declined. That flexibility, that redundancy, it's the ultimate armor against the managed decline of the industrial economy.
This shift towards self-sufficiency and intentional decoupling from the corporate or government-dependent world seems to be the underlying trend for survival.
Absolutely. The argument is that self-employment is increasingly the future of employment, particularly in providing needed goods or services that the Lenocracy is too inefficient, bureaucratic, or expensive to offer. This requires a fundamental change in financial strategy.
How so?
Adopting the concept of being self-invested. Instead of passively putting money into highly abstracted financial instruments like savings accounts, 401ks, or trusting in the increasingly fragile Social Security system, you put your money into tangible, productive assets, tools, skills, training, land, materials.
An investment in resilience.
It's an investment in localized resilience and productive capacity, not abstract financial speculation.
That makes sense. The skills and tools remain productive regardless of the currency or the regulatory climate. What are some concrete, practical niches that fit this mold goods or services that the current centralized system fails to provide effectively?
There are several examples that operate successfully beneath the radar of the large corporations and the centralized extractive economy. One is the trading of secondhand goods, often called the scavenger economy.
This is more than just selling on Craigslist.
Oh, it's far more. It's about cultivating the vision to see value where the system sees only waste. By consciously shopping secondhand, you are actively recycling, putting money into the pocket of an individual or a charity, and bypassing the high overhead, debt-fueled retail systems. It requires embracing the search for items as a kind of recreational treasure hunt and developing practical repair and evaluation skills.
What's another niche?
Another crucial one is providing localized support for cottage industries. Centralized accounting and tax services are often prohibitively expensive or too complex for microbusinesses. One example cited the deep, unmet need for local bookkeeping services, particularly for small businesses desperate to keep tax collectors at bay by maintaining meticulous, clear records.
So you're supporting local producers.
While maximizing your own flexibility and control outside the corporate overhead structures that require massive compliance spending.
And the simplest of all, food. The one thing people will always need.
Exactly. Simple, cash-based food operations are a universal opportunity because the Lenocracy fails to provide high-quality, affordable food without massive corporate overhead. Here's a specific example of a family setting up a tent and a portable grill outside a gas station on weekends to sell high-quality, authentically prepared Mexican food.
And they can undercut the fast food chains.
They can undercut mediocre fast food chains on price while providing a far superior product. This just shows how easy it can be to find a niche where people want a product. The Lenocracy, with its endless regulatory and operational overhead, simply cannot provide affordably or effectively.
These strategies focus on physical local exchange, which naturally brings us to the most fundamental way of walking away from the marketplace. Rebuilding community exchange through the gift economy.
The fundamental mistake people make about the gift economy is defining it as a system for exchanging stuff.
It's not about that.
It's clarified that it is first and foremost a powerful mechanism for building and maintaining community and relationships. The goods or services exchanged, a freshly baked loaf of bread, a few hours of childcare, a repaired engine, are merely the medium for the real transaction.
And the real transaction is?
The strengthening of a social bond, the weaving of a trust network.
That's a huge distinction. Market exchange is about an instantaneous transaction, demanding equality of price right now. The gift economy sounds like it's about long-term obligation and relationship building.
It is entirely about long-term relational obligation. The strength of the community bond is directly reflected in the time that can comfortably elapse between receiving gift and reciprocating it. If I fix your car today and you offer me your bookkeeping skills 6 months from now, that delay doesn't weaken the relationship.
It confirms the trust.
It confirms the trust inherent in the bond. Conversely, immediate repayment is often seen as rejecting the relationship entirely. It's like asking a relative, "How much do I owe you for that elaborate holiday meal?" You're rejecting the generous relationship and attempting to impose a transactional market price on their hospitality.
So the gift imposes a social obligation.
The receipt of a gift imposes a social obligation to reciprocate, which is the exact mechanism by which community bonds are maintained and strengthened outside the transactional reach of the Lenocracy.
That system inherently requires a high degree of trust and proximity. It sounds like it cannot be abstracted or run through some online algorithm.
That is correct. The gift economy requires a physical nexus or hub, a local brewery, a gardening group, a community workshop, or just a consistent physical gathering space for the trust and personal relationships necessary for the system to unfold. Physical presence is paramount.
Why?
Because assessing character and building the trust required to maintain those reciprocal long-term obligations necessitates face-to-face interaction. The digital realm is too easily gamed and too fragile for the deep, localized trust needed for true community resilience.
Another strategy sometimes proposed for local resilience is the formation of co-ops community centers or food distribution networks. Are co-ops immune to this lenocratic influence, or is the complexity trap always waiting?
Unfortunately, they are highly susceptible to lenocratization. it is crucial to manage expectations and risks. While co-ops can be wonderful community centers and sources for local products, there are several common pitfalls. Some co-ops slowly morph into corporations with members instead of shareholders, losing their original intent and becoming just another layer of bureaucracy. Others suffer from serious internal flaws like embezzlement by volunteer bookkeepers or treasury staff, which leads to financial ruin because accountability is lax.
And there are legal risks.
Most dangerously, yes. Improper incorporation or insufficient legal protection can leave board members personally liable, sometimes causing them to lose their homes in lawsuits driven by aggressive regulatory bodies or civil claims.
So if you engage in co-ops, the lesson is clear. Be hyper-aware of the risks and actively manage the threat of both financial and legal lenocratization.
The biggest risk is assuming that simply because a venture is nonprofit or community-focused, the system's extractive mechanisms will ignore it. They won't. The moment a co-op handles significant funds or physical assets, it becomes a target for the very complexity and extraction it was designed to resist. Resilience requires constant vigilance.
This entire deep dive has been a relentless examination of how the price of what the managerial elite calls climate atonement, this massive administrative wealth transfer driven by the Lenocracy, is being paid not by the financial elite themselves, but by the dispossessed working and middle classes who are being forced into the managed decline of the industrial economy.
And the irony defining our era is just inescapable. The very system demanding this austerity and control is itself collapsing due to fundamental physical constraints. We see the very minerals required for the green transition, copper, platinum, are limited by the affordability ceiling. And the essential fuel needed to run the global supply chain, diesel, is facing a critical cliff in the very near future. The extractive machine is running on empty, using complex debt schemes and moralizing rhetoric to justify its continued existence, while physical reality forces an inevitable contraction.
That final synthesis brings us right back to the contradiction we started with. The managerial class is running a complex, abstract, extractive machine, yet the physical limits imposed by energy and logistics are forcing a radical, rapid decentralization towards simple, local, resilient communities.
The current global system is optimizing relentlessly for centralized financial extraction. It's relying on ever-increasing complexity to justify its high overhead and its punitive cuts against the producers. However, history teaches us that when a society's energy basis shrinks, and the diesel cliff represents an immense physical contraction, the growing complexity required to manage the existing system quickly offers diminishing returns and collapses under its own structural weight. If the global system's only remaining tool is to increase complexity and extraction, the very definition of Lenocracy, while its energy basis shrinks, then the necessary collapse of that complexity offers the profound opportunity for individuals to stop pretending to be governed. They can find genuine safety and prosperity not by attempting to win a global competition against the managerial elite, but by fostering local relationships and building tangible skills that are already, by definition, outside the reach of the infinite debt ledger that defines the collapsing industrial age.